I will say I did anticipate more problems with snakes, but there really wasn't. We had a few sightings along the way, but
Yep.
they really weren't an issue for us. But
I mean, they
you
were.
kind of alluded
You
to it.
say they
Go
weren't
ahead.
an issue, but I'm not as terrified of snakes as some of the teammates we brought down there. But we saw them
Well, yeah.
at least two or three trips, and I saw it. I remember Eric on our team was with me, and I was like trying to get a picture of it. He's like, "You're crazy! Get away from that thing!" I was like, "Yeah, but I just wanted to document." But we saw some snakes, and I don't know what other snakes we didn't see that were there, but.
Yeah.
All right, welcome back, crew, to the Jomny podcast, where we explore all things urban horticulture through the perspectives of the many amazing people who have made it their career. I'm your host, Mark Minnie, president of John Minnie Distinctive Landscapes, and at John Minnie, our purpose is to make places beautiful by bringing nature to the places people live, work, and play. All right, welcome back to our four-part project spotlight on the Winter Garden Palm Tree Project. The Winter Garden is an iconic space in downtown New York City, and it's part of Brookfield Place. At the heart of this space stand 16 Washingtonia robusta palm trees. These trees are introduced to the indoor atrium at about 35 feet tall and grow to upwards of 60 feet before needing to be replaced with a new set of trees. This is a replanting that occurs every 10 years or so, and while this replanting culminates in a 2-week overnight planting, the project totals over 3 years of hard work, and our 4-part project spotlight breaks it down for you. If you haven't already, take a listen to part 1 of this project, where we provide some context on why the trees need to be replanted and share the history and importance of this landscape. In part 2, today, myself, Bob Presner, and Andrew Engel from the John Minnie Distinctive Landscapes team recall our experiences finding and acclimating the new set of palm trees for New York's iconic winter garden. Plant finding and acclimation are tricky and often overlooked parts of an indoor landscape. And the plant finding phase of this project is filled with exciting challenges, including inclement weather and wildlife. If you enjoy our conversation, I have 2 simple requests that would mean a lot to us today. 1, please kindly give us a like, a subscribe, or a review on whichever platform you consume your podcasts. And 2, be sure to tune in to the next parts of this project spotlight. In part 3, we walk through the 2-week overnight installation. And in part 4, we talk horticulture maintenance for long-term success. All right, without further ado, let's head over to my conversation with Andrew and Bob. All right, we're here as part of our 4-part project spotlight on the Winter Garden palm trees. Today, we're sitting down with Bob Presner and Andrew Engel from the John Minnie Distinctive Landscapes team to discuss the tree finding, the digging, the potting up, and the acclimation process of this intensive project. So today, we're going to kind of, discuss, the initial steps of this project, which is essentially like a 3-year long project that culminates with, as we know, these 16 Washingtonia robusta palm trees in the Winter Garden atrium in New York. Why don't we start with why we started so early? Like, when did we start and why? Do you want to take a stab on that one, Bob?
Sure. Well, one of the main reasons for starting, certainly a bit earlier than we had in previous um, refreshers of the palms, was due to the fact that one of the main players, a grower here in Florida, was no longer in business, and his nursery, which also had a shade facility capable of acclimating the palms, was no longer available. Um, the industry, plant industry in Florida, especially when it comes to large plant material, has been shrinking. So there aren't that many players involved. And so it was initially, we thought, as Florida's growing of plant material is shrinking, we need to probably get out ahead of this, because it might take some time to actually locate the palms that we needed. But more almost as importantly is find somebody who'd be willing to, um, you know, take the palms on, acclimate them, build a shade house, all of the things that were going to be required to make the project work. So it
Yeah,
started.
it's a really good point. Just to interject there, like part of it is, that industry consolidation. There is no there's not many large uh, tree nurseries in Florida that support the indoor industry, right? That have that shade house that acclimate the trees, which we're going to talk about later. So we need to find somebody who's willing to do that. But also, I think you have to find a key partner to I guess the other reason is like to find like inventory, right? Like that's not a simple solution. We're up in New York, and there's certain places in the country we can go to potentially find these trees, but there's no
Mhm.
like nursery you can just call and say like, hey, do you have you know
Yeah. On
16
hand.
35 foot Washingtonia robusta palm trees all looking exactly the same, right?
Yeah, and I think that's key because again, certainly in Florida and throughout the Southwest United States, there are nurseries growing palm trees. I mean, obviously, you look at a lot of the landscaping around the country where the environment, the climate allows for palm trees. I mean, they're there, they're being grown, but what we were looking for is palm trees that could actually be used indoors, which is certainly the acclimation process, but it's also the look. Palm trees that are being used in the landscaping, outdoor landscaping, they can have some bumps and bruises. They can have little bends and kinks and things. It's almost this very natural look. But in actuality, what we were looking for is 16 perfectly straight, aligned, with trunks that were of equal caliber, coloration. That's when all of a sudden it starts to get tricky. You can find thousands of palm trees, but can you find 16 that look alike and are as close to being identical as possible? And I think that is really what made this very tricky.
We had to start early on because we didn't have that partner in the industry, right? Who could
Right.
not only like build the shade house for us, but also help us locate, possible fields, right? Like that are sometimes like or often like unlisted or, unknown to our industry and, scattered all over Florida. So, fun story or important story is, tapping our, relationships and our experience in the industry. I think it was Jack Harris, our VP of sales, connected with an industry legend, Bruce Jensen, who ran who was a grower in Florida for decades. Strong relationship there, personal relationship he had there. He actually talked to him, and he recommended the partner that we ended up working with, which is Ben McGrill at Pahokee Palms. And I think Bob, you met Ben, like you were saying, June of 2021.
21. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Kind of interviewed him in his pickup truck.
There you
And
go.
and as he showed us, he has a pretty massive nursery of palm trees. Uh, but of course, he didn't have any Washingtonia palms that would be adequate for our job, and nor did he have a 45-foot shade house. But he was excited about the project. Was certainly interested in getting involved, helping us find uh, the palm trees that we needed, and was willing to build a shade house that could actually do the project for us. Um,
And obviously, then
and
we all got to meet Ben. He was, incredible businessman and just a great partner, quality person, um,
Mhm.
and unparalleled palm tree knowledge, right, and experience, right. Obviously, we had to bring to the table our knowledge of like, well, how do we prepare these and get them in an indoor environment, but from just like a science and knowing of varieties and connection with the industry and where to find palm trees, unparalleled experience. Um, so then I think that's a good segue to you starting before we even select, because we're talking about a project where we got to select 16 palm trees for this indoor project 3 years out. But before we select palm trees, we got to find a field.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, and part of our process uh, was really to get Ben up to speed on exactly what is it that we were looking for.
Sure.
We went so far as to have him come up to New York and actually visit the site of the palms to see them, to get a real sense of that. What are we looking for? But again, Ben knows palms, but Ben's business is predominantly had been outdoor palms for people, and there is a difference, in terms of handling. There's definitely a difference in terms of uh, how they're prepared, the whole acclimatization process. It's not that Ben wasn't familiar with it, but we wanted to really make sure that he understood. And part of the initial going out into the field with him was to just look at palm trees, and for me maybe to just very quickly surmise, these aren't going to work, or
Sure.
this is what we're looking for. We need them to be a little taller. So this way he could start to hone down on what we were looking for, by having some real knowledge, not just us saying something or just showing him a picture. We actually went and started to look at palms, and through that process of elimination, we ended up finding the field where we were able to select from.
Yeah, 100%. So part of it is like you're like, by actually going to the fields, like putting into context, like what are we talking about here? Like what kind of trees are we looking for? How particular are you guys going to be? You're right. That's like key in those first few field, assessments. And then it's like, well, now that he's starting to get it, and then I think even like Andrew and I started joining on some of those field search trips to say like, all right, now that he understands, like, can we find the field now? Yeah, and we did. Like, I think we looked at, I mean, how many fields did you probably visit? In
At least seven.
Yeah,
At
I
least
think that
seven.
feel like that was the number we threw out there because it's hard to keep track of all that stuff. Like 7 to 10, I feel like was the number of quote unquote
Probably say,
properties or
yeah.
fields that we looked at. Yeah,
Yeah. I've lost count at how many times I went to the actual field that we did select from. So
sure.
it does get a little confusing.
Yeah,
I feel like I spent the better part of 2 years at the one in Bureau for sure.
yeah,
It yeah, and I think what would really I found so helpful, um, is that Ben really bought in to how important of a project this was, not only to
yep,
us, but just in general. The Brookfield Winter Garden is unique. It's special. He truly bought into, boy, I want to be part of this. And his patience with us, because we were demanding. He
yep.
wanted to see things over and over again, measurements and so forth and so on. He never blinked an eye. He was so 100% in support of our mission, and really became, he was part of our team, and is to this day. He's part of our team, will be, because
Yep.
his efforts were that good.
Yeah, I agree 100%, Bob. And like, that's, I'm glad you brought that up because it's off like the, us sharing the technical process of this, but it's not the technical process, but it's equally as important is if you want to build uh, an important indoor landscape, a marquee space, or in this case, a very like, just, this one's like a fabric of like it has historical importance as we talked about in the first part of this project spotlight. Um, we took the lead, quote unquote, on installing this project of horticultural care, but all great projects require a phenomenal team inside and out, from the client and their belief and their vision to us, we're, leading the project management from soup to nuts to your trusted partners, the grower, the nurseryman. Everyone matters and everyone needs to buy in and why this project's important. Back to field searching. So, I think it helped to also, I don't think Andrew and I understood like how difficult, we're like, oh, we got to find 60 trees. That's going to be hard enough. And we didn't even understand how hard it was going to be to find the field until I think Andrew and I went down there, because it wasn't just a matter of finding a field that had potentially the inventory we we're looking for. Like, but then we came down one trip. I remember we saw like 3 fields in 1 or 2 days, and one of the fields actually looked like it had that potentially like had a lot of Washington robusta trees, like tons as far as the eye could see. But we only got to look at and measure a few of them because accessing the field was just like incredibly challenging. It's like I don't even remember how we got to the field. We drove through like it was like some weird point on the GPS we went to. It wasn't an address. Then we went down like a bunch of dirt roads. Some guys kept unlocking fences, and we got in the middle of nowhere. And we're like, wow, we could see a ton of these trees, but I mean, we walked through some of the overgrowth, and I was like, I don't know what I'm gonna step on at some point. I'm gonna be attacked by a gator or something. And we just couldn't access the trees, which was crazy, right? So you need to, where we talk about it, these need to be 16, almost matching palm trees in height and aesthetic and all this stuff we're going to talk about. But we couldn't, if we can't access the field in some methodical and intimate manner, then that nixed out that field, for example. So there was these other layers of challenges that you didn't really understand until we actually went there and looked at the fields.
Yeah, I think it's important to state that a lot of people, most people think that if they even have thought this far ahead, is that you can go to Florida and there's just nurseries that have a collection of plants, and you can just pick out what you want. They're all in a row and so forth. When you're doing a project like this, and you're talking about fields, these are spec fields. That some of these things have been planted 50 years ago, maybe even more. And someone bought a piece of property and said, hey, they're going to need this kind of plant, these kind of trees, these kind of palms. And they plant, who knows, 1,000 of them. And they just let Mother Nature kind of care for them. Yeah, they send somebody in every once in a while, maybe to mow the weeds around them. But basically, they're just growing like they were in nature. So when you go to these fields, yeah, as you're saying, I mean, it's a process of just finding the courage to walk through
Yeah.
swamp grass up to your neck. And that that is also an important part of the thing of this process, is that you've got to have access to them. You've got to be able to see them. And the field that we ended up picking was, we didn't want to pick multiple palms from different fields. I certainly felt very uncomfortable with that. I wanted to select palms that had been basically growing in similar soil conditions, similar everything. And to me, it was important that we could find the palms in one location. The field that we did pick allowed us to see really upwards of 2,000 palms. Sometimes not easily because the grass wasn't cut, but for the most part, so much more easily than other fields that we had gone to. That's not to say that we couldn't have found 16 palms elsewhere. I'm sure we probably could have, but the process would have been extremely difficult.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, we could dive into that. Let's it's a good segue to like, so we finally select that field.
Right.
And yeah, it was more accessible. It wasn't absent of environmental challenges for sure. So now we've got a field, and we actually think we can potentially find the viable candidates for this project, these trees.
Exactly. And I think, again, part of our process was back in late 2021, we went and really took the most accurate measurements of the existing palms that probably have ever been taken, from heights, calipers, calipers at different heights on the trunks. And so we had a good database of what we were looking for. So that gave Ben and I a good starting point to try and go through. I mean, sometimes it was clearly obvious there were some palms in this field that were, probably pushing 50, 60 feet, maybe even a little bit taller. And then, of course, a number of them were shorter than what we wanted. But we were looking for, this 35-foot height range. We were looking for a certain caliper size at the base. We wanted to make sure that they were able to fit through the tree grades. And so over what probably took a couple of days, which took more than more than a week. It was probably about a 2.5 week process. Ben and I went through. We took pictures. We shared them with New York, and we temporarily tagged number of the palms so that when the team came to visit, we'd have at least a basis to start to go through. And in that
Mhm.
process, some of the initial ones that we tagged were clearly they didn't make the cut. But along the way, having other eyes from the team looking at, we actually selected a few others that
Yep.
Ben and I had not selected, and some of those actually, the end result was some of those actually made it to the final 16. So,
Definitely.
it truly was a team process of making those selections.
Yeah, no, 100% a team process. So we get to that field, and yeah, we're trying to find. Also, and I think I don't know if we've given this context in this episode at this point. We're looking for 24 trees, right? Because we're actually gonna take 24 for acclimation, so we can have a final 16 for shipping and installation. But
Right.
we're you make it sound so easy. It's definitely a team process at this point. I think between, you, me, Andrew here, Ben. I mean, I don't even remember exactly. We were just joking before we got on and started recording because like how many how many trips? I don't even remember how many trips we went down there. You were there and when we weren't down there. And these are not just like one in and out. These are like 1 or 2 or 3 multi-day trips where we
Yeah.
are going going through this field to find these trees based on height and caliper measures. But it was very precise estimate of we were looking at 2,112 trees just within this one field, and we and we came up with that number because we actually did a calculation. This of the fields we looked at, again a little bit more accessible, happened to be planted in rows, and in it had 2 sides of the field in rows. So we took a quick count on how many. Well, not a quick count. You actually have to like walk. I don't know how many acres to actually count the rows. We had to walk acres to count the rows and how many trees were in each row, and assumed there were a few missing in each row. And we came up with that calculation. And I remember sharing it with Ben, and obviously an experienced farmer. He was like, "Oh yeah, based on the acres, that number actually is right. I was going to say around 2,000." So we were looking at over 2,000 palm trees very methodically, like you said, going to like all the ones you had tagged, then revisiting the field multiple times and measuring the height of each tree multiple times in 2 different forms: overall height, because that aesthetic matters in there, but then an also more consistent height measure, which would be the clear trunk,
Mhm.
as well as taking caliper measures, which is a whole nother thing because we had to clean up the old fronds that were being held at the bottom of the tree, so that we could see if there were the bark was not delaminating, or if it had a nice aesthetic look to it and it wasn't kinking and it had a nice taper to it, so it all looked beautiful on site. But we were doing this for like we at least walked all those trees many a times, but then got into many of them in a very methodical manner and documented all that data.
Well, Mark,
It's
they
like,
say hindsight's 2020. So yeah, in retrospect, yeah, it wasn't that big of a deal. When it
yeah,
was
you're like, yeah, we just walked and found out.
when it was 95 degrees and the humidity was like over 100, it was like just yeah,
Well,
it was a real
why don't we
process.
go into those? Like, I feel like we could talk about the technical piece of it, which is like you have to you know get the measurements of all these trees. You have to caliper height measurements. Um, you have to obviously look at them as also just from an experienced horticulturalist. You have to look at them and do they look good? Do they look healthy? Do you visually see any disease or pest potentially? And that's the technical side of life. But the environmental challenges you bring up also, I think it's important that we highlight how long and difficult this process is, because it puts into context the things you have to go through to make a beautiful project, an important project, come to fruition. So what were some of those environmental challenges we dealt with in these several multi-day trips?
Well, certainly weather temperature and humidity were
Yep.
on some of the trips. And again, we had to take a lot of breaks. Just
Yep.
sit back in the truck, drink water. It was, I think pretty demanding. Again, we're all in pretty decent shape, some better than others. But the bottom line is that I don't think anybody is truly in shape to be on a plant safari under those conditions. Certainly,
Yep.
there were insects. I think most of us got bit at least once, probably more than that
Oh
by
yeah.
by fire ants.
Andrew's
I
the only
got
one we got a picture of, like jumping around, taking his shoes off, and swatting them.
Yeah,
yeah, we're
they
from up north, sometimes you're just not thinking.
yeah,
Meanwhile,
well,
Yeah.
just walking around like
that
there's nothing going on, but
that is the truth. Um, I will say I did anticipate more problems with snakes, but there really wasn't. We had a few sightings along the way,
Yep.
but they really weren't an issue for us. But I
mean, they were.
kind of
You say they weren't an issue, but I'm not as terrified of snakes as some of the teammates we brought down there. But we saw them at least 2 or 3 trips, and I saw it. And I remember Eric on our team was with me, and I was like trying to get a picture of it. He's like, "You're crazy! Get away from that thing!" I was like, "Yeah, but I just wanted to document it." But we saw some snakes, and I don't know what other snakes we didn't see that were there. But
yeah,
Oh well, yeah, they were probably
Yeah.
there, but you know what? Thank God they're more afraid of us than we are
Yeah,
of them.
exactly.
Believe it or not. So, yeah,
just gotta
they
have some
hear us
confidence, make a
coming,
little
they're gone.
noise. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. But that's also the conditions, the walking conditions around. You're not walking
Yes.
down sod pathways. Uh, there were water issues, mud. Slight flooding in some areas.
Yep.
The grasses. We have pictures of us standing in the grasses where the grass is up to our neck.
Yep.
Which is for a whole psychological. It's you're walking through and you
Psychological,
have
for
no
sure.
idea where your feet are going. What are you stepping on or into? Because in most of the fields down here, once they dig a tree or a palm out, they don't come back and backfill. So you've got these 3 foot by easily 3 foot holes in rows. But again, you're walking very diligently, and again, the terrain itself is it's really very irregular. It's not flat.
yeah, it
So
would be easy to sprain your ankle. I feel like I almost did a couple times because the grass is so high.
Jack definitely did.
Yeah,
he's lucky he didn't sprain his whole body. He felt pretty good.
Yep.
I have to admit, it's happened to me a few times over the
Yep.
and
years of walking around there.
if you don't sprain your ankle, you're definitely stepping in some sort of like muddy puddle that you did not see coming.
Yep.
So yeah, it's definitely pretty wild, and it's in the there's not like it's not like it's a place where there's a nice breeze. It's not like the coast of Florida. It's
Yep.
inland. Gives you a lot of respect for what people do in the agriculture industry, like out in those
True.
hot fields. Here, there's very little shade, so the car was pretty pivotal. Like I don't think I've ever had as much water in my life as I did some of those days.
Yep.
But yeah, it can make it taxing and taxing to do things precisely and stick to like, a systematic way to go through all those palms. The other thing for me is like they environmentally, but also technically looking at the palms, they all still they're known as bearded palms because they hold their fronds. So accessing and seeing how the trunks look is very difficult. It's not a regular thing that the growers would just strip those trunks for everybody. Most people just sort of are able to say we need 20 palms for the roadside. They look pretty good, look pretty straight. But we were really looking for something that's going to be highly critiqued. So, but also in some of those old fronds and whatnot, there's definitely a lot of insect activity, other things going on. And they're sharp. They're very, very sharp.
Yeah, the fronds themselves have like little shark's teeth on them.
Yeah. The petioles are definitely
they're
very
really sharp. They got like shark teeth on them. So I think all those also contribute to kind of the difficulty of the process.
Yeah, no, it's like we like to joke, and I know our marketing team is always like, highlight, how challenging this process is, like highlight the wildlife piece, because everyone's like, oh my God, fire ants and snakes. I think we dealt with wild boars, like ripping our tags off of our trees at one point. Bees were like a thing. I got bit by a tick, whatever. But I agree. Like, so that's like the whoa, like everyone wants to hear about like snakes and fire ants from Florida. But I think like that terrain that you guys brought up and the weather, those environmental challenges, in my opinion, were like the ones you don't think about. Maybe aren't as like quote unquote flashy or sexy, but which were the most challenging ones. Like that, even that trip where, like you said, that overgrowth, that undergrowth is going to grow fast, and it was up to shoulder height on one of the trips where we actually were doing a pretty important double check on the selections before digging them. Even when it wasn't that high, it was always at least 1-2 feet at points that you were walking around, which means you can't see the terrain, the puddles, the holes where trees have been dug before. So no matter which trip it was, you were dealing with that terrain challenge. And then environment, like the weather was it was crazy, right? So you said, I think 95, 98 sometimes, Bob, was the temperature, but the real feels with humidity and the full sun that days was way over 100. And
probably over 110 mark. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not just about, it is important, like about how do you endure and walk through and stay healthy through that and hydrated, but we're also doing like not only physical but mental task work there too, where we were working so hard, the four of us, to be so methodical about like, all right, we got to measure each tree. You got to, in 2 points, right? You got to measure the taper, the caliper, to make sure the taper looks good on the trunk. And we're collecting data, right? Like writing this stuff down. Easy to make a mistake, right? Like if you're sitting there and you're like, I'm tired, I'm sweating, it's 100 and something degrees out here, I just stepped in a hole. So we were working hard to, one, measure twice over times. Like I think when we did select trees, we went back a second trip and measured them. We put in processes within this tree finding plan, whereas like the four of us were looking at and measuring trees. Then we brought a secondary team in. We expanded the selection team to 2 other teammates. So it was like a fresh perspective. And in that trip, we would measure again and get other people's opinions on the look and aesthetic of the tree. But these were all things we were doing, double measuring, taking breaks, obviously, and hydrating, and bringing in a new set of John Mini teammates to make sure those environmental challenges weren't getting the best of us and we weren't making any mistakes, because man, those were some serious environmental challenges.
But by the time we were getting to the end of any one of our visits there, if it really wasn't for the fact that there was a team of us working together, any 2 people would have had to give up a little bit sooner, because you're right. You're exhausted. The weather is definitely literally beating down on you. But you're right, the mental challenge. It was tough to keep yourself not only motivated but also keep yourself precise. If you think about it, just to measure the clear trunk and the overall height took at least 3 people. You had to have one person on the pole, which also was not a one-person job, because when you're holding a 35, 40-foot pole up in the air, you do a few of those, it wears you out. Mark, you can attest to that. But also so where's the top of the measuring stick? To see that, you might have to go 2 rows over to get an angle so that you can actually see the tip of the pole where it is the tree, and you need to catch it from a couple of different angles. So you got 2 people who are just spotting that, yes, you're at the top of the tree, you're at the CT, and of course the person who's holding the pole, probably someone who in the meantime has been taking a caliper measurement, maybe writing down the data. So it's a team effort. Without it would have taken a lot longer, for sure. Andrew brought up a really good point about the older fronds actually creating a skirt. And sometimes on Washingtonians, that would go from the ground all the way up to
Yep.
the head of the palm tree, the new fronds. So you really couldn't get a real good look at the trunks. And occasionally they created an illusion, which looked like maybe there was a bend or a kink. Um, and so, I see it and it's straight. Andrew says, I don't know. I think it's got a kink. You have Mark's looking at it, looking at it, and and sometimes we decided, it's a kink, so we're not going to do it. There was always discussions. It got even a little bit more complicated, but again, more precise when we invited, I think it was 3 other people came down and looked at them with us. And so now all of a sudden you had a lot of different opinions, but it made the process, it elongated it, but it made it more precise, because these different sets of eyes were seeing it from different angles and saw things that maybe, when we were there last time, we were all exhausted. That was like the last couple of palms we looked at. And yeah, maybe we were tired and maybe we weren't seeing it as clearly. Now you've got fresh eyes down there. So, I mean, again, I think about our process of trying to select these palms was in depth, intense, and we really peeled back the onion, if you will, to really get a good feel on picking the best palms.
And let's talk about, so it's like a multi, so we're actually, we're doing these assessments on these trees and then we're physically, tagging the trees, right? But we, at any point, we had
Right.
probably upwards of, anywhere from 35 to 50 trees tagged at a point. So you're going through this field and untagged trees and you're doing these measurements and assessment, then deciding to tag them. But then we're getting that, at any point, 35 to 50 trees tagged. Then you have to go back to those trees and do those assessments with that either expanded team or the same smaller team to say like, all right, let's rediscuss that tree or let's remeasure that tree or, find the best out of these ones that we currently have tagged. And even that came with with a couple of challenges. Like, I think we actually tagged some trees and then we had trouble finding them because, again, wildlife, I think we assumed it was wild boars. We're actually ripping the tags off of trees that we had, tagged. And we found out because we saw the excrements of these animals like near the tree and the chewed up tag next to it. Which we also, to our data collection point, how difficult it is. This is a massive field. So we were able to still find those trees that the tags had been ripped off of them because we had tracked, like, within this field, we had come up with a grid system saying like row, this row and this many trees into that row. And that's how we refound trees. Right. But again, also then there's this multi-visit trip. One of the environmental challenges we didn't even highlight was storms, because, and I think we did get kicked out of fields or cut short a couple times because at any moment, it would look 98 degrees and perfectly sunny out, and all of a sudden, boom, it was like a thunderstorm and rain on you, and you're like, we got to get out of here. So we had to accommodate around those things.
Yeah, and certainly over the process of selection, this is Florida, and you go through hurricane season.
Yep.
We actually did have some hurricanes that made some close visits towards that area. I remember going up, a day or two later just to double check. Fortunately, none of our palms actually suffered. Some of the older ones, they're actually snapped in half. There were also palm fronds everywhere, 3 feet deep, just blown off of the trees, which made getting around really difficult and really dangerous because, as was mentioned earlier, the petioles on the fronds are they're like saws. They have so many sharp spikes coming out of them. So it really was very treacherous at times as well.
I definitely stepped on a frond once, and that the petiole shot up. The way I stepped on it shot up, and it grazed right across my leg, and ripped right through my pants, and give me a couple small lacerations. All right, so I guess we go through that process, and at the end, these are right now our best candidates for shipping and installation at the end of the day. So we now need to get them out of the field, right? We need to dig them out of the field, transport them to the nursery and pot them up and prepare them for acclimation, right? Again, easier said than done. What that process looks like of digging them out of the field and getting them to the nursery.
Well, a couple of things. One, obviously, we had the final selection. They were all tagged. We had them gridded out, as you had mentioned, so the positions were clear. The owners of the field, they had their own nursery team, and they were responsible for doing the digging. I was on site for that along with the team. They used a piece of equipment, basically a tree spade. And what they did is they went around.
Tree spade, right? I think it's cool.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And that's how the trees were actually dug. Once dug, they were actually sort of put down onto their side. They were strapped, and then they were sort of laid down on their side, so that a lot of the old fronds could be removed. They were all removed, and the root ball itself was wrapped in plastic. They used a plastic wrap to seal in any moisture, and they were moved individually to a pickup point where they would be shipped from. And that was a 2-day process to get the 24 dug, and also in that same 2-day process, we began shipping them using a gooseneck trailer, I believe. Mark, we had, I think, eight per tree. We were there to observe and make sure that everything went smoothly. But you're dealing with people who this is what they do for a living. They move around massive trees. They have the tools, the equipment, and the know-how to do it.
But our oversight was important for, I would say, there's two things there. One, we have also, there were always, like, throughout the process, times where we, probably to, the teams we're working with, like, pain in their, their side, because we were like all about slow down the process and be a little bit more methodical, because these guys are pros and moving huge material, shipping it across the state or into other states at times. But often for an outdoor landscape application and or in high volume, where, a little nick on this tree here, or a couple fronds falling off, or, something happens, not a big deal. But we were like, whoa. We went through this 2,000 plus field with a methodical, a needle in a haystack with all this data, and these trees need to look precise. So at every step of the process, we had to be mindful and reemphasize, like, it's not your typical project, for anybody involved. You got to be careful. And then the other thing is, crazy when we spaded them and dug them and then potting them up into, eventually these 200-gallon pots. But I think maybe they typically probably would have done them in larger pots, because they are 30, if you measure them in indoor, style from the grow pot up, they're 37-foot trees. And we were forcing them into these tiny pots in proportion to how big the trees were, because that was the constraints set by the site. So obviously we had to be part of that process, saying, like, all right. And I would say, you said it was one of the easier parts, but that was almost one of the most stressful parts, is watching these huge trees get, chopped up and the root system chopped up and potted into these tiny little pots.
That's something you can do with all types of, trees. So it's, palm trees have a very fibrous root system that you can go pretty close to the trunk. There's all sorts of rules and guidelines on it, but it is pretty fascinating to see how much of the root system they're able to take off. It truly is like a giant tree in a tiny pot.
Wild. 200 gallons sounds big, but like when you see the picture of, like, one of these trees being picked by, the equipment, the lull, and like it's this huge tree hanging in the air with this tiny, when it's in the air like that, this tiny little, root system left. It's, it's nerve wracking for for the
Yeah, it
horticulturists at
looks
least.
unreal.
Me, I'm like, oh.
Yeah.
What was most nerve-wracking for me is after they were all potted up and they were standing and they were starting to root out was waiting for them to root out.
Mm.
Uh,
Yep.
I was there on a weekly basis, uh, digging down the sides of the pots, looking for any sign of like, are they actually putting roots out? In the first couple of weeks, I didn't expect very much. By the time I got to like week 3, 4, man, I was like grasping at anything to see. And then,
Yep.
well, lo and behold, that in the 4th week, we started seeing some, very hair-like roots starting to pop out. And
Yep.
once that happened, it was incredible. They really rooted out very, very quickly, which I'm
Yeah,
sure is
definitely
probably what's
nerve-wracking
happened
point.
now that they're at.
And it's a perfect segue, right?
Yeah,
Because that shifts
yeah.
to, the acclimation period. So, and one thing before we get there, though, I do want to emphasize is you said it like, it was within 2 days. So we were digging and shipping 8 trees at a time. Or on it, we're not digging it. We were shipping 8 trees each day to the nursery, but those 8 trees were dug and shipped and repotted up within 2 days, and then the next batch and the next batch, but it had to be precise in the scheduling of that. And I know we came down for that whole week essentially when we did that process,
Hmm.
because of all this fear. You're like, all right, well, you're taking these huge trees, you're chopping them down, you're staging them horizontally, you want to get them into a pot, backfill some planting medium in there, and irrigate them and get them settled in so they can start to root out. But you don't want to just like, let them sit there for a week in this unnatural state. So the precision and scheduling of that dig to shipping to nursery was a huge piece of it, which was
Yeah.
an awesome coordination between Bob and Ben's team and the owner's team. We had to like manage all that precision. Sorry, go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah.
I mean, I was just gonna say that, and behind this, like the whole time you're monitoring for health, obviously, because
Yep.
at this point you've just opened up a ton of wounds in the, on the roots. So it's just another factor that you're looking at. But yeah, that's all I had to say.
Well, I was
Yeah,
going to
no,
add
definitely.
one
And I
thing
think
is
that, go ahead.
I was going to say that some people might question and say, well, geez, why wouldn't you root prune first before you actually dug them? That's a great question. And we made a decision based on the weather in Florida. We were planning on
Yep.
digging these in early December. Hurricane season here officially ends the end of November, but Florida can be a really windy place, and pop-up storms are pretty much a constant year-round. Um, we were really concerned that if we root prune these, we might have the possibility
Yep.
of wind actually knocking them over, or bending them and maybe hitting them into other palm trees. So the decision was is to just tree spade them and dig them at one shot, not do any root pruning on them. Again, most of the time, these nurserymen on big things, especially like big trees and stuff, will do a root pruning. Palm trees, again, with the root ball size that we were going for, it would have been dangerous to do a root pruning beforehand.
So we get them. So let's go there where Bob, you were going is, I think, the first part of the acclimation process. So we get these 24 trees and methodically in these few days, shipped to the
Right.
nursery and then potted up into these grow pots.
Mhm.
And then how does it look like from there?
Well, again, a couple of items. One is the type of soil that we used. Uh, yeah, as you mentioned earlier, a lot of trimming had to happen to the root balls once they arrived at the nursery. So that trimming not only took roots from the bottom, but all the sides of the root ball. Um, Again, 200-gallon grow pots. What type of additional soil were we going to add? And we've had great success with success soil, so we use that. and it drains really, really well. And we felt that it would be perfect, and it really was. It worked out great. Um, the transfer from the native soil that they were growing in into the new soil was pretty much seamless. And this, we also use that soil in the planting of them in the winter garden. So they literally, this exact same soil that they were growing on in the grow pots was also the soil that they would be growing in the planters once they were planted out.
Yep.
That process, like I say, it took nearly a month to really start getting some root development, and then it was pretty rapid from there. Obviously, the nurtureman, the grower, um, at that point started applying some fertilizer, something that he would normally have used. Um, and so started also a pest control program because, again, that was key. We wanted to make sure that by the time we were ready to ship these, which was going to be a while from the time we potted them up, a year and a half or more, we
Yep.
wanted to make sure that when they got to New York, they were clean.
Definitely. Now, you just said it, about a year and a half. So, we dug and we potted these trees up at the nursery. And a year and a half is like the total acclimation period. I've got them from the field before they
Mhm.
ship. You want to break that down?
Yeah, they were in about 7.5 months. They were actually still not in shade, but they were containerized into grow pots. They were guy wired so that they could stand straight, and there wouldn't be any issues with wind knocking them over. Um, while that was happening, the shade house um, uh, was going to the structure of the shade house was constructed, but the actual shade cloth wasn't on. In about 7 months, 7.5 months after they were potted up into grow pots, they were moved um, uh, around so that we could actually get the shade over the top of them. The palms themselves in their grow pots, growing in direct sunlight, were actually in the shade house structure. So all of the support structure and beams were all in place. The one thing that was left off was the shade cloth, and then the palms were moved around in such a way so that the shade cloth could be placed over the top of them. So, yeah, about 7.5 months. They were actually growing out roots and you know having sun-grown fronds, which of course um, were doing really, really well, but we were really excited to get them into shade. And in that, the color of the fronds darkened up almost pretty quickly. Within about a month or two, we noticed the color darkening, and also the new fronds that were coming out had longer petioles. So they actually started to spread a little bit. And we've noted that over the years that the palms within the winter garden tend to get some pretty massive spread on them, and that's really it's just due to the simple way that plants work. Those fronds are there to collect light. If you reduce the light somewhat, the plant's going to try and compensate by maybe creating a bigger surface to collect as much sunlight as it can to go through its natural process. So even putting it from sunlight into shade, you start that process happening. That is the acclimatization process.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that went on for, well, I'd say 11 months. We
Yep.
acclimated them, and then they were ready to ship.
And let's not downplay. I'm not saying you are, but let's emphasize the the feat of creating a shade house just for this project. There was no such thing as a shade house tall enough to support a one of a kind project like this. So essentially, for this project, with the vision of the client, right, starting with them and their commitment to this space and this iconic planting, we're building the largest one of a kind shade house specifically for this project. And you walked it through almost so precisely that it's like that's not easy. You're building the structure of this. These are like 50-foot telephone poles. You're putting trees, not little trees, big trees in place in this structure. Then you're putting shade over that. And there's a lot of moving of the trees and equipment needed, obviously, to assemble that shade house, which is
Sure.
pretty unique and cool endeavor. Um,
Yeah. I was going to say, yeah, I mean, the actual structure, the main support beams are telephone poles. Um, they actually are closer to 60 feet in length.
60 because yeah, they're like 8 feet in the
Yeah,
ground, right, or something.
we're 8 feet in the ground, which is interesting because, where the nursery is, you dig down 8 feet, you actually start to hit water.
Yep.
So, getting all of the telephone poles secured in the ground and then concrete poured in to, make them solid. I think the thing that I was most impressed with is the strength of the wiring and the guy wiring that goes up to the structure. They use, and I'm not sure the correct term, but they use these ground screws that they screw into the ground to hook the cables into, and this is all makes the structure rigid, that you can actually put the shade cloth on. Even though the shade cloth is permeable, it still acts as a strong windscreen. And with the winds down here, you've got to make a structure that really is very, very strong. And that was the thing that I was probably most impressed by is um, how strong and how well built the framework of the shade house had to be. You know, in a terrible storm, or if they knew one was coming, there are good chances that nurserymen would just cut the shade cloth off. That's kind of replaceable. But what you don't want to have is a huge sail sitting there in the middle of the field, getting just beat by the wind. But they really made it very, very well, and that very impressive, and very labor intensive process.
Sure.
It was a big commitment on Pahokee to nursery to say, hey, you know what? Yeah, let's do this. I mean, it's some undertaking to put up a shade house.
So the trees are here at the nursery, um, containerized in full sun, rooting out, then under shade for acclimation. Andrew, what are some of the things you're looking for during these times?
Well, you want to look for anything out of the ordinary. So we have 16 or more, sorry, more, shaded. So we're looking to see if, anyone looks any different than the other. If so, why? But we're also just, practicing horticulture and looking for any sort of disease or any sort of stressor, biotic or abiotic stressors. We've had, and Bob, correct me if I'm wrong, but there was another interior-scape company that had brought a couple of these washies up. I think they had fusarium or something that took them down, and they had, we connected them with Ben, and they got another set. But there are certainly things that can happen, and so the whole project is just a big risk in that sense. But we're looking for any signs of insects, any signs, so anything, and then of course nutrient deficiencies and stuff like that as well. So simple kind of like plant pathology assessments, sort of. So we took to really see if they have like pretty much their deadly diseases. You actually have to take like like PCR tests, like people had to do for COVID. So it's kind of doing um, a little bit more in depth science, and you have to take sawdust from the trees actually and submit them. We work with the University of Florida, have a couple really great contacts there, both in the entomology department, but also in the soil department and in their plant pathology lab. And so samples, checking everything's good, but also, just preventative other types of measures, like obviously like nutrients is a preventative measure for there being a possible imbalance in the future. But so yeah, a lot of washing the trees down as well, and just keeping them clean. It's also you're bringing these palms from a field into a palm grower's environment, so of course that's a risk for them as well. So they're particularly careful about it, how they treat them also. So yeah, there were a couple mysteries along the way, a couple findings. We found palm leaf skeletonizer there, which was not really a big concern overall,
Which
but we were
is,
able to
what is
get it.
palm leaf skeletonizer? It's like
It's pretty
an
big.
insect.
It's like a big
Yeah, but it's an insect.
yeah.
Somebody's probably listening being like,
Yeah,
what is that?
yeah,
Is
yeah,
that
yeah.
like a game or no,
Oh, it's
it's
big.
like an insect. Yeah. I remember Bob taking a picture and sending it to us. And we're like,
Yeah,
whoa.
yeah.
I think you sent a picture and it was like not whoa, but then you put a pen next to it and it was like, no, that's a big insect.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the size of, at least it's a moth that's the size of at least a hummingbird, maybe
Yeah.
bigger.
Yeah, it's crazy.
But it's real. The real issue is, as Andrew knows, is um, they they lay eggs, and the eggs bore into the actual the frond, and they basically just suck the chlorophyll out of the frond, and it sort of just leaves you can almost see through it. So the leaf almost becomes transparent. Therefore, the name skeletonizer, because it basically turns leaves into skeletons.
Yeah.
And that's where the real problem is,
Yeah.
and not easy to get rid of once they're in. The best thing to do is obviously kill um, the moth that's laying the eggs, and also cutting off those fronds that actually have um, been laced with the larvae that are doing the damage. And it's a process, as Andrew, you can attest.
Totally. Yeah.
Took us a little while to get rid of it.
Definitely. Definitely. I mean, you examine everything from the roots to the tips of the leaves, everything in between. I think other thing like there were termites. That's just something I'm not used to seeing really on indoors. Just a little bit, but you're extra cautious about everything. Some like mushrooms in the soil and whatnot. So just like paying attention to, you know, stuff like
Yep.
that, soil health, soil analysis, and then
Yeah, yeah, and I think it's important. You bring up termites and fire ants as well.
Yep.
Yeah, again, these palms for at least the last 20 something years have just been growing in a large field. This is not a groomed per se field, so it's very natural. It's very native. So yeah, things like fire ants and all kinds of things have habitated. So yeah, you start digging up a root ball. What's ever in the root ball is coming with you.
yeah,
So
Yeah.
we had a couple of guests take a ride from a couple of miles in Florida to the nursery. But yeah, again, so we had to do some soil treatments as well for those problems.
I think the one thing that we noticed that they did have was a type of petiole blight. It's not something that would take the tree down, so it's not something that would be like lethal to it. And more of a consequence, I think, of the environment that it's in. They're native to a little bit more arid environments, so I think the humidity in Florida just it's more probable that they might get some little bit of fungus or something here and there.
Mhm.
But with diligent testing and whatnot, and also consultation with some of your experts in the field. Richard Murray, we actually had as a consultant. He worked with Lynn Griffith, another kind of legend, and so just put all the best minds together, and we we gained our confidence essentially. But there's no book on any of this stuff really. Yeah, it's really exciting to be able to solve these things and figure them out, and yeah, it's like horticulturally engaging. So it's awesome. It's an amazing project.
Yeah, that's really cool. That's a good point. Yeah, it's based on our experience, and we're the ones writing the book. Anything else during like the acclimation period?
There was a debooting or a
Sure.
skinning, if you will, of the petiole attachments that, once you cut off a frond, that doesn't mean that the entire boot, which is the portion that's connected to the trunk, that doesn't come off just naturally. It has to be removed. And to do it well is a real process. Um, we had the first probably 4 to 5 feet of each of the palms stripped so that we could actually see the trunks and get our measurements in terms, so we could accurately get 16 palms that looked very close to each other. Actually, the 24 all met a criteria that we were able to establish in that first 4 to 5 feet of the trunk. But beyond that, they all had to be stripped up to 20 feet from the top of the root ball. That process didn't happen until about roughly, I would say, about 5 months, 6 months before we ship them. We strip them up to 20 feet, all of them. That, of course, brought up a number of things that you never knew were there, you didn't see. Was that kink really a kink? Yes, it is. Um, uh, you know, what's the scarring? There was some delamination of the bark
Yep.
that you wouldn't have seen. So the reason for 24 made a lot of sense, because we did have to disqualify some of what we would seem to be perfectly beautiful palms because of cosmetic, if you will, issues. So much so that we decided to actually get 2 additional palms, which was a little bit later in the game.
Yep.
But we felt that, God forbid something goes wrong. So we made the decision, let's get some backup. So total, we had 26 palms. And out of the 26, actually 21 of them made a final selection, 16 of which were actually the 16 that we felt were the best. And that came down to the final decision day. Actually, I think we had a final decision, and then the next morning we revisited and we made I think one adjustment. Again, it was a very critical process, as it needed to be, and I'm very happy with the way it turned out from my perspective. I think everybody else is too.
Agreed. Yeah, it's hard to like not end on that. That was such a critical process, and like how methodical we were on it. One lesson, or one takeaway I would want to leave for the audience, at least as at this part of like when we highlight this part of this massive project spotlight, is obviously we're all biased, but I do believe indoor landscapes are a critically important part of our built environment, especially in cities. And what people don't think about is, to make impactful, and especially large scale, but any impactful indoor landscape come to fruition, it requires important planning, right? I think Bob said it maybe at one point, or like you can't just like, maybe some people's back of their heads like, oh yeah, I've heard about this industry in Florida. They just call it Florida and get some trees. But, often it takes a lot of planning, because they're, especially when we're dealing with large trees or any landscape, is you have to find the inventory as a living product. It has to be acclimated and prepared and shipped for indoor use. So one of the takeaways is, you got to have that foresight. You have to have that understanding that, important and impactful indoor landscapes take the proper planning.
Takes time. I mean, you have to find a partner. You have to find a field. You have to find a shade house or build one. You have to, find a way to dig the trees and transport the trees and assess the trees and acclimate the trees, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So
you gotta, I'll toot our own. You gotta find badasses like us that want to deal with all the challenges of the The snakes and the fire ants and
Yeah.
the heat. The heat.
Well,
Well,
no,
we're
it's a good
passionate. You got to find people who are
point.
passionate about what they do, passionate
Right.
professional horticulturists, because without our passion, I think, for this world and this project, especially, like, you're not going to have that endurance to deal with the things that we went through to make sure that this project comes to life.
And for the grower too, for your partner, you
Yeah,
need somebody
100%.
passionate, because otherwise they won't understand, the impact, the meaning, and how, critical,
Yeah.
why we're being so critical, and why we need to, and how this
Yep.
is different. Some people just don't want to deal with that. It's just too much. Or
I mean, I would share a key, probably maybe one of the most important keys is the team and communication that was set up. We met very early on in the process, and we went from excuse me, monthly meetings to bi-monthly meetings to weekly meetings, and then there were always off of that splinter meetings of smaller groups who were working on specific aspects of this job. That communication basically shed light on all the aspects of this, and so that all of the players who were involved in our team, they all knew their role. It was pretty clear exactly what everybody was going to be taking care of, and in the end, that really made for great communication. We were really able to share with each other. Fortunately, Jack and myself had been through this a number of times. So you had sort of the old guard who could share with the new guard what was going on. But again, if it wasn't for communication meetings, I know people go meetings. You do a project like this, you need to have meetings. They need to be organized, not like some meetings that get carried away and go off on tangents. What are we talking about today? Let's solve these issues. What's our homework? Report back. It was. I think it was great to work with this team. And so my recommendation to anybody who's working on, I don't care what size project it is, make sure your communication is really solid, and don't be afraid to meet on it and go over details.
It's awesome. I agree.
That's
those
it.
are awesome. Yeah, those are awesome final takeaways. And to circle back on what Andrew said, yeah, partners are huge. Shout out to, again, Ben McGrill from Pahokee Palms. He's a legend in my books. Love working with the guy. Love the guy in general, as well as you guys. You guys are legends in my book. This part of the process was awesome, but it was hard. But it was also fun. So I appreciate you guys going through it with you guys and taking the time to share your thoughts and the journey.
Absolutely. It's been my pleasure.
Much gratitude to Andrew and Bob for their time today. Please stay tuned for part 3 of this project spotlight, where we walk through the on-site installation of these 16 palm trees. Spoiler alert, this installation requires incredible scheduling and precision, driven by some pretty atypical constraints when compared to your average landscape site. Thank you to all our listeners for taking the time to be here with us today. Guys, thank you for joining us on this journey. If you have any questions, ideas for future episodes, or my favorite, any constructive feedback, please email us at podcast@johnmini.com. And a big final thank you to all our clients at John Mini Distinctive Landscapes. You guys allow us to make our passion our profession. None of this is possible without your support and vision to bring nature to places people live, work, and play. And I'd be remiss in not giving a special shout out to Brookfield Properties and their partner CBRE. Brookfield maintains an inspirational vision to invest in transformative and one-of-a-kind commercial spaces, and their investment in the Winter Garden Atrium in downtown New York is a perfect example of this. It's an absolute honor to play a role in making this space come to life. Thank you, Brookfield and CBRE, for your business and ongoing support. All right, this episode's a wrap. Have a great day, and be sure to find a moment today to cherish the nature around you.